If your primary resource for reliable information about transportation safety in America is the current administration, you could be forgiven for thinking New York is incredibly dangerous. But I prefer data. So today we're going to look at the US metro areas with the most and least transportation fatalities per capita, get a sense of where and why they happen, and then later in the video we'll dig into some data that I think can help us understand the relative safety of driving versus transit. Because having spent most of my planning career immersed in this kind of data, one thing I've always felt is that most of us are just kind of numb to the epidemic of traffic violence. Like, if I tell you that in 2024, in Greater San Antonio, there were over 300 traffic related deaths and one transit related death, which is true, I would fully expect your first question to be, geez, what was the one? So today, I'm going to challenge us all to think rationally. I've got two data sources I'm going to bring in. One, the 2024 database from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Fatality Analysis Reporting System, which geolocates every traffic fatality in the US, and I've aggregated by metro area. And two, the Safety and Service Monthly Modal Time Series from the National Transit Database, and I've aggregated the 2024 data from that by metro area as well. And let me just state clearly right up front that every data point from both of these resources is just enormously heart-wrenching. There's a story of devastating and completely unnecessary personal loss behind each one of these. Also, to keep this manageable, I'm going to focus on larger urbanized regions, so the 19 metro areas in the US over 3 million population, but I'm going to share some smaller outliers as well, so stay tuned for those. Also, death is grimly simple as a data point because it's kind of a binary, but it's also only a small fraction of the mayhem that happens on our transportation system. For every fatality, there are dozens of people who survive transportation violence but are left with severe injuries that are disabling and oftentimes financially devastating, and nothing about this video is intended to minimize that. So, needless to say, this is going to be a tough topic for squeezing in Cheesecake Factory jokes, and as compelling as those are, I think the findings we get to by the end of this video are even more interesting. So, let's get into it. We'll start with the major metro area with the highest number of deaths per capita in 2024, the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino, California. 639 traffic-related deaths, 2 transit-related. That's 13.4 deaths per 100,000 people in a calendar year. You can think of that in terms of probability, and no, not driving isn't necessarily going to improve your odds given how many of the fatalities in these crashes are pedestrians. Also, for each of these, I'm sharing a location where one of the fatal events happened. I'm not going to try to comment on it or diagnose it. I'm just going to let us all sit with it. Second deadliest in 2024, the Phoenix metro area with 13.3 fatalities per 100,000. So right away, you can probably start to see a theme here. I'm sure there's some statistical analysis you could do with all of this to draw correlations to things like walkability or vehicle miles traveled per capita. I'm not going that far, but just keep those things in mind as we go through the list. Third deadliest, Tampa Bay, 13.0 fatalities per 100K. 444 traffic crashes and 2 transit related. And I know you're very curious about the 2 transit related, and I will dig into that data when we get to a city with a larger sample size. But for now, I urge you to be approximately 222 times more interested in the driving related fatalities. 16, South Florida, 11.6 transportation related fatalities per 100K in Greater Miami, Fort Lauderdale. The reality is, for just about every city, even one with heavy rail transit like Miami, the number of transit-related fatalities is practically imperceptible compared to the number of traffic deaths. Also, the street design in Florida, probably not helpful. 15, the Houston metro area, 10.3 fatalities per 100,000. You know, the vast majority of these happen on arterial roadways, and in most of these metro areas, this is what those look like. Designed to maximize for travel speed, probably not designed to minimize for tragedy. 14, Dallas-Fort Worth. Interesting how cities from the same state cluster together on this list. Kind of makes you wonder about state level roadway design standards. Anyway, 10.0 fatalities per 100K, and no, you are not imagining that the 6 worst of the 19 metro areas over 3 million are all in the Sun Belt. 13, Denver, and now we're under 10 per 100,000. You know, I did look at this by city initially, but my sense is that because things like traffic patterns, roadway design, and driving culture tend to be more regional, that was a better unit of analysis. But in case you're wondering, 63 of the 292 traffic fatalities were in Denver proper. 12, San Diego, 9.4 fatalities per 100,000. And I am going to move through some of these pretty quickly so we can get to the most interesting part of this list. 11, Southeast Michigan, 8.4 transportation fatalities per 100,000, epicenter of American car culture and home to some truly horrific road design, including a road so famous it got its own movie. 10, the literal middle of the pack, Metro Atlanta, 8.3 fatalities per 100K, and the first metro area on this list with double-digit fatalities on transit. Remember I did these by metro area, and metro areas in the US are organized by county, so that's how I aggregated the crash data. Fun fact, the Atlanta Metropolitan Statistical Area includes 19 different counties. 9, Greater Philadelphia, 8.2 transportation fatalities per 100K. What you're not seeing here is that as we go up this list, it becomes harder and harder for me to find obviously objectionable locations, so keep in mind, street design is important, but in some ways it's a band-aid on larger structural issues with land use and transportation. Well, I'll explain more when we get to number 1. 8, Seattle-Tacoma, also 8.2 per 100,000. Look, even our most nominally progressive metro areas still have far too much of the transportation network that looks like this. What's especially galling is regional planners understand all of this. The Puget Sound Regional Council maintains a high injury network map that flags roadways where a disproportionate number of fatalities and serious injuries happen. Pretty much every major metropolitan region in the US maintains something like this, so for your homework, go find the high crash corridor map for your city and look into what's actually being done about it, and maybe make some noise. 7, honestly surprised to see LA this high given its reputation as a hotbed of spectacularly aggressive driving, but I really think this is another case of the reality of what LA is like on the ground continuing to diverge pretty radically from what LA is in the popular imagination. And yes, the city does have a high injury network map, with a stat that you'll find echoed in pretty much every US city. 6% of city streets account for 70% of deaths and severe injuries for people walking. Okay, top 6 still to come. I'm actually pretty uncomfortable suggesting that any metro area is good at this and should therefore rest on their laurels, but I think there are going to be some pretty interesting takeaways from the city that tops this list. And I've got a few smaller metro areas that I want to mention as well. Last call for April 24th at Hunter College Assembly Hall in New York City. Well over 1,000 urbanism nerds registered last time I checked, and tickets may still be available. Check the link down the description. Other upcoming travel plans. DC in late May/early June is booked. No event plans yet, but stay tuned. Likewise, Minneapolis-St. Paul in late July will definitely be filming content at minimum. And Austin, Texas, in-person event is happening, so hold September 3rd if you're interested. So what's going to become very clear by the end of this video is there are significant disparities between different metro areas as far as the rate at which people get seriously injured, or worse, just trying to get around their city. And to me, it's an equity issue. People who live in walkable and or transit-rich places have the opportunity to avail themselves of an incredibly safe and efficient mode of travel, while people who live in places where you're basically forced to drive everywhere have a lot more day-to-day exposure to traffic violence. And that brings me to the metro area that had, by far, the highest fatality rate of any I looked at, Greater Memphis, Tennessee. I actually had to back check these numbers because they're so atrocious, and to the credit of the state of Tennessee, they do have a good data portal for this stuff, but man, it does tell a really depressing story, and Memphians deserve a lot better. Then, on the other end of the spectrum, I wanted to shout out a couple of smaller metro areas that would actually be top 4 if I was including them. Greater Providence, 5.1 transportation fatalities per 100,000 in 2024, and Honolulu Metro, so basically the island of Oahu, 5.4 fatalities per 100,000. Pretty compact urbanized area and very high bus ridership. Okay, top 6, see if you can figure out some common denominators. Chicagoland, 7.6 fatalities per 100,000, and almost none of them are happening on the L or any other transit vehicle. In fact, Chicago DOT knows exactly where the vast majority of transportation mayhem is happening. 5. The DMV, 7.1 fatalities per 100,000. Actually, a little lower in the central city itself if you break it out by city, 6.7 per 100,000. And that dynamic is the same in all of the top 6 metro areas, but almost uniformly opposite at the bottom of the list, where the central cities tend to fare worse. For the Bay Area, 5.8 transportation fatalities per 100,000 residents in 2024. So now we're at less than half the fatality rate of the metro areas at the bottom of this list. The city of San Francisco, a bit better than the Bay Area as a whole, and yes, they do know where all the carnage is happening. 3. Minneapolis-St. Paul, 5.0 fatalities per 100K. Since I know you're wondering, Minneapolis is 4.2 and St. Paul is 5.9. This metro area isn't quite the transit ridership powerhouse others in the top 6 are, but it's no slouch, and it is one of the top US metro areas for bike mode share. 2. Greater Boston, 4.7 per 100,000, and only 4 transit related. Boston proper, slightly better at 4.0 crashes per 100K, and yes, the city does know the streets where all the chaos is happening. And number 1, America's perpetual outlier, the New York City metro area. Actually not radically different from Greater Boston in overall fatality rate, but it's the way it plays out among modes that's fascinating. By far, the metro area with the highest number of transit-related fatalities, 127. So the fact that New York is number 1 overall on this list really tells you how relatively low the rate of traffic deaths is. And this brings me to one of the main takeaways. Traffic deaths are heavily correlated to how much driving there is, and residents here drive significantly less, clocking something like half the VMT of the national average. In other words, in a lot of ways, traffic fatalities are a function of exposure. By the way, if you want a deeper dive into the safety benefits of living in a dense place with abundant transportation options and an enlightened approach to street design, my Hoboken video from last year has you covered. But the reality is, the New York metro area is full of Hoboken-like places. And yes, there are car-dependent suburbs here too, but just not to nearly the extent you find in other US metro areas. Okay, let's talk about transit fatalities. 127 is an enormous number in the context of this list, and it's definitely 127 too many, but also it's less than a fifth of the number of driving-related fatalities in the region. And if we look at the census commuting data for 2024 in the New York metro area, about 50% of people drove to work and over a quarter took transit. So another way to look at this is driving accounted for around twice as many trips as transit, but over 5 times the fatalities. In a way, it's even worse than this though. The NTD categorizes every transit-related death, and for New York, for the sake of simplicity, let's focus on MTA Heavy Rail, aka the New York City subway, which accounted for the vast majority of the region's transit fatalities, 118. You can actually get tons of detail on the individual events from the NTD. The most basic way to split these is passenger fatalities, 13, fatalities on transit property, so a subway station in this case, also 13, and then the remainder are quote-unquote other fatalities, which we'll talk about in a sec. Just to give you a sense of the danger for passengers, there were over 2 billion rides on the subway in 2024, and of the 13 onboard fatalities, 5 were homicides, 6 were people who were outside the vehicle, like between or on top of cars, and 2 were due to actual rail collisions. Like, yes, it's still 13 too many, but I think I like my odds here better than driving around Phoenix. Then the 105 other fatalities are things like people deciding it was a good idea to walk along the tracks in a subway tunnel, and actual self-harm. It's really tragic stuff, but it's not something that makes me feel personally unsafe if I'm just going about my business riding the subway. So in a lot of ways, the 127 transit fatalities overstates the supposed danger of transit. Okay, last bit on this. You might have heard at some point, possibly even on this channel, that the New York region accounts for roughly half of all transit trips taken in the US. Well, according to the NTD, the total number of transit fatalities in the US in 2024 was 345 compared to like 40,000 traffic fatalities. So New York, with only 127, doing pretty well. So yeah, thanks for your concern, Secretary Duffy, but I think I'll be sticking with the subway. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and special thanks, as always, to the patrons, whose direct support helps keep this channel running like the well-oiled machine it is. Thanks to all the Nebula viewers, too. I'm all about platform diversification. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode in a couple weeks, and I'll see you then.